The crimson sun dipped beneath the jagged horizon as Gideon Whitman's weathered fingers traced the fresh carved letters on the modest wooden cross. Rebecca Whitman, beloved wife, 1842–1873. The 32-year-old cowboy had barely spoken a word since the fever took her 3 days ago, leaving behind nothing but memories and the faint scent of lavender that still clung to her pillow. The wind whistled through the cottonwoods surrounding the small plot of land Gideon had chosen for her, just beyond their homestead where the wildflowers grew thickest in spring. His knees pressed into the freshly turned earth as the first stars appeared overhead, pinpricks of light in a darkening Montana sky. The territory was still wild in 1873, unforgiving to those who didn't respect its power, but Rebecca had loved it fiercely from the moment they'd claimed their parcel 4 years earlier. "You always did like watching the stars come out," Gideon whispered, his voice hoarse from disuse. The nearby creek bubbled softly, providing the only response to his words. He'd built their life together with his bare hands, a modest cabin with 2 rooms, a small corral for the horses, and fields that had just begun to yield respectable crops. Rebecca had transformed the humble dwelling into a home with curtains sewn from flour sacks and wildflowers in tin cans on the windowsills. Her absence felt like a physical weight pressing down on his chest. The night grew deeper around him, but Gideon couldn't bring himself to leave. The thought of returning to their empty cabin, to the bed they'd shared, was more than he could bear. So he sat, his hat in his hands, the silver wedding band on his finger catching occasional glimmers of moonlight. "I don't know how to do this without you, Becca," he admitted to the night. The words fell like stones into a bottomless well. "I don't know how to wake up tomorrow and the day after and keep going." A slight breeze stirred the tall grass around him, carrying the scent of sage and earth. Gideon closed his eyes, remembering how Rebecca would tilt her face toward every breeze as if greeting an old friend. Minutes stretched into hours as memories washed over him. Their first meeting at the general store in Butte, where he'd been so struck by her smile that he'd forgotten what he'd come to purchase. The day he'd nervously asked her father's permission to court her. Their wedding beneath the big oak tree in her parents' yard, with Rebecca radiant in her mother's ivory dress. The moon had traversed half the sky when Gideon felt it, a presence beside him. Not a sound, not a movement, but a certainty that he was no longer alone. Slowly, he opened his eyes. There, sitting cross-legged beside him at the foot of the grave, was Rebecca. His heart stopped. She looked just as she had before, the fever honey-brown hair cascading down her shoulders, green eyes reflecting the starlight, wearing the blue calico dress he'd bought her for Christmas. But there was something different, too. A translucence to her that made the grass behind her visible if he looked hard enough. Gideon's breath caught in his throat. He wanted to reach for her, to call her name, but fear paralyzed him, fear that any movement or sound would shatter this impossible moment. Rebecca didn't speak. She simply gazed at the wooden cross bearing her name, then turned those familiar green eyes to his face. A small, sad smile played at the corners of her mouth. They sat in silence as the night deepened around them, 2 figures bathed in moonlight, one solid, one ethereal, saying nothing, yet communicating everything. Dawn found Gideon still at the graveside, alone. He couldn't say when Rebecca had vanished, only that at some point he'd realized her presence had faded like morning mist. Sleep had claimed him briefly, and he woke with dew dampening his clothes and the memory of her sitting beside him vivid in his mind. Had it been a dream? A hallucination born of grief and exhaustion? Gideon couldn't say for certain, but the comfort her presence had brought felt real enough. With joints stiff from the night's vigil, he rose and placed his hand on the cross one last time before walking back toward the cabin. There were chores to be done, animals to feed, crops that wouldn't wait for his grief. The following days passed in a fog of routine and memory. Gideon moved mechanically through his tasks, speaking only when necessary to his livestock. Each night he returned to Rebecca's grave as darkness fell, sitting silently with her wooden cross, hoping. On the 7th night, as he settled into his now familiar spot, she appeared again. This time, Gideon was certain he wasn't dreaming. Rebecca materialized like a watercolor painting coming into focus, the edges of her form softly blurred against the night sky. Again, they sat in silence. Gideon, afraid to shatter the moment, kept his questions locked behind clenched teeth. Why was she here? How was this possible? What did it mean? Instead of asking, he simply watched her from the corner of his eye, memorizing every detail of her face. As the first light of dawn threatened the eastern horizon, Rebecca turned to him fully. Her lips moved, though no sound emerged. Gideon strained to understand, but before he could make sense of her silent words, she faded into the morning light. The pattern continued for weeks. Each night, Gideon would sit by her grave, and most nights, Rebecca would join him. Sometimes she appeared immediately. Other times, he waited hours before sensing her presence. Always, they sat in companionable silence until she disappeared with the approaching dawn. Word spread through the nearby town of Sweetwater that Gideon Whitman was spending his nights at his wife's grave. Some folks whispered about grief driving a man to madness. Others spoke of devotion with admiration in their voices. A few of the town's women, widows themselves or those seeking a husband, began making excuses to visit his homestead with food or offers of help. Gideon accepted their charity with mumbled thanks but sent them away quickly. He had no interest in their pity or their intentions. His heart remained buried in the grave beside which he sat night after night. As summer gave way to fall, Gideon noticed changes in Rebecca's appearances. She became more solid, more present. Though still silent, her expressions grew more animated, her gestures more defined. Occasionally, she would reach toward him, though her hand always stopped short of touching his. One crisp October night, as frost silvered the grass around them, Gideon finally broke their silence. "I miss you something fierce, Becca," he whispered, his voice rough from disuse. "Every day without you stretches like an empty road." Rebecca's eyes filled with a sadness so profound it made his chest ache. She reached out again, and this time Gideon felt the faintest sensation, not quite a touch, but a disturbance in the air near his hand, like the brush of a butterfly's wing. "Are you really here?" he asked, voice cracking. "Or am I losing my mind bit by bit?" Rebecca's lips moved in silent response, and though no sound emerged, Gideon somehow understood her meaning. "I'm here as much as I can be." That night marked a shift between them. Though Rebecca remained unable to speak in a way Gideon could hear, they developed a form of communication, his spoken words, her silent responses that he somehow understood more clearly with each passing night. The townsfolk's whispers grew louder as Gideon's behavior became more noticeable. He spoke aloud at the gravesite, seemingly to himself, smiling occasionally at empty air. The local preacher, Reverend Thomas, paid him a visit one afternoon, concern etched across his weathered face. "Son," the older man said after declining Gideon's offer of coffee, "folks are worried about you. Spending every night out there talking to yourself. It ain't natural." Gideon's jaw tightened. "With all due respect, Reverend, how I grieve is my business. The Lord gives and the Lord takes away, Gideon. Rebecca's with him now. You need to accept that and rejoin the living." "I appreciate your concern," Gideon replied stiffly, "but I'll handle my grief in my own way." After the preacher left, Gideon pounded his fist against the cabin wall in frustration. They couldn't understand. How could they? They hadn't seen Rebecca's spirit, hadn't felt the comfort of her silent presence. That night when Rebecca appeared, Gideon sensed her agitation immediately. Her form wavered more than usual and her eyes carried a warning. "What is it?" he asked. Her silent message came to him clearly. "They think you're mad. They'll try to take you away from here from me." "Let them try," Gideon growled, but anxiety gnawed at him. What if they succeeded? What if he was forced to leave this place where Rebecca's spirit could find him? The next day, Gideon rode into town for supplies, aware of the stares and whispers that followed him. At the general store, Martha Jenkins, the proprietor's wife, touched his arm sympathetically. "Gideon, we're all so worried about you," she said softly. "Robert and I were thinking perhaps you might want to sell your place and move closer to town. It can't be good for you living out there alone with your memories." "I appreciate the concern, Mrs. Jenkins, but my home is my home." Her expression grew troubled. "There's talk of having Dr. Wilson examine you. People think you might be unwell in the mind." Gideon's blood ran cold. I'm perfectly sound of mind, grieving, yes, but sound. He finished his purchases quickly and rode home, tension knotting his shoulders. That evening, as he sat by Rebecca's grave, he found himself watching the road, half expecting to see a group of concerned townsfolk coming to drag him away. When Rebecca appeared, her form was fainter than it had been in weeks, barely visible against the darkening sky. "Becca, what's wrong?" Fear clutched at him. Her message came faintly. "I'm fading. Your connection to this world is weakening." "No," Gideon protested. "I won't let that happen. Tell me how to help you stay." For the first time, frustration crossed her face. She seemed to be struggling to communicate something important, something beyond their usual simple exchanges. Finally, the message came through, fragmented but clear enough, not just grief, something unfinished, truth hidden. Before he could ask what she meant, Rebecca's form dissipated entirely, leaving Gideon alone with his confusion and fear. For the first time since her death, Rebecca didn't return the following night. Gideon sat by her grave until dawn, calling her name periodically, but the air remained empty of her presence. The night after that yielded the same result, and the night after that, desperation grew within him. Had his visits to town somehow weakened whatever force allowed Rebecca to appear to him? Or was there something more to her fading, something connected to the unfinished business she'd mentioned? After a week without seeing her, Gideon made a decision. If Rebecca couldn't come to him, perhaps he needed to search for her. Her last message suggested there was something he didn't know, some truth he needed to uncover. Gideon began with Rebecca's belongings. Though it pained him, he opened the trunk at the foot of their bed where her personal items were stored. The scent of lavender rose to meet him as he carefully lifted out her dresses, shawls, and the small wooden box where she kept her few pieces of jewelry. Beneath these lay her journal, bound in faded leather. Gideon had never read it during her life, respecting her privacy. Now, with trembling hands, he opened the cover, seeking any clue to what might be keeping her spirit restless. The journal chronicled their life together, Rebecca's hopes and fears laid bare in her neat handwriting. She wrote of her love for Gideon, her joy in their homestead, her longing for children that had not yet come. But in the entries from the months before her death, Gideon found something unexpected. March 15, 1873 received another letter today. "I wish they would stop coming. I've made my choice and have no desire to revisit the past. I haven't told Gideon about them. What good would it do except to worry him?" April 2, 1873, another letter came while Gideon was in town, more demanding this time, threats veiled in politeness. "I burned it like the others." The past is the past. April 27, 1873 saw a rider watching our homestead from the ridge today. "Could have been anyone, but my heart tells me otherwise. I'm frightened but cannot bring myself to burden Gideon with this." The entries continued, growing more concerned with each passing week, until the final entry written just days before she fell ill. June 12, 1873, he was at the general store today, pretended not to know me, but his eyes followed me everywhere. I fear what he might do. If anything happens to me, the letters are hidden beneath the loose floorboard under our bed. Gideon must know the truth then. Gideon's hands shook as he closed the journal. Rebecca had been keeping secrets, had been afraid of someone, and now he had to find these hidden letters. Dropping to his knees beside their bed, Gideon ran his hands over the floorboards until he found one that moved slightly under pressure. Using his pocket knife, he pried it up to reveal a small space beneath. Inside lay a bundle of letters tied with twine. The first letter was dated January 1873, addressed to Rebecca Whitman in elegant handwriting. "My dearest Rebecca, I have finally located you after these many years. You cannot imagine my surprise to discover you living as a frontier wife, so far from the comforts you once knew. I understand that you believed you had no choice but to flee, but circumstances have changed. Your father's debts have been resolved, and there is no longer any impediment to our union. I implore you to reconsider your hasty decision. Whatever rough life you have established with this cowboy cannot compare to what we might build together. My offer of marriage still stands, as does my affection for you. With deepest regard, Richard Hargrove." Gideon felt as if he'd been struck. Richard Hargrove. Rebecca had never mentioned the man. The subsequent letters grew increasingly insistent, veering from declarations of love to thinly veiled threats. The final letter, dated just 2 weeks before Rebecca fell ill, chilled Gideon to the bone. "Rebecca, your continued silence leaves me no choice. I shall come for you myself. If you will not willingly return to civilization with me, I will be forced to reveal certain truths about your past that I'm sure your rustic husband would find distressing. Would he still look at you with adoration if he knew of your family's disgrace? Of the circumstances that drove you west, I arrive in Montana territory within the fortnight. Make your choice before I make it for you." R.H. Gideon's mind reeled. Rebecca had never spoken of any scandal, any past beyond her childhood in Illinois. But now he wondered, had her illness been natural, or was there something more sinister at work? The realization hit him like a physical blow. Rebecca's spirit remained because her death might not have been from natural causes. There was unfinished business, indeed, the truth of how she died. That night, Gideon returned to her grave with renewed purpose. "Becca," he called into the darkness, "I found the letters. I know about Richard Hargrove. Please come to me. Help me understand what happened." For hours, nothing changed. The night remained still and empty. Then, just as Gideon was losing hope, a faint glow appeared at the edge of his vision. Rebecca's form materialized clearer than ever before. The sadness in her eyes was unmistakable, but there was something else to relief. "Was it him?" Gideon asked, his voice breaking. "Did Hargrove do something to you?" Rebecca's silent communication came stronger now. Bitter taste, not just fever. Gideon's hands clenched into fists. "He poisoned you," she nodded, her expression pained. "Came while you were in the fields, offered to wait, prepared tea." I knew too late. Rage unlike anything Gideon had ever felt coursed through him. "Where is he now? Still in the territory?" Rebecca's next message stopped him cold. "Staying at Jenkins' boarding house in town, planning to leave soon." "Tomorrow," Gideon vowed, "I'll confront him tomorrow. Make him confess, make him pay." Rebecca's expression shifted to alarm. Dangerous, careful, evidence in blue tin on his shelf. As dawn approached, Gideon outlined his plan to Rebecca. He would ride into town, confront Hargrove privately, force him to reveal where he kept the poison, and then bring him to the sheriff with evidence of his crime. Rebecca's spirit seemed agitated by this plan, but Gideon's mind was made up. "I'll see justice done, Becca, I promise you." As the first rays of sunlight touched the horizon, Rebecca's form began to fade. Before she disappeared completely, she seemed to press her lips to Gideon's cheek, the faintest sensation, like morning mist against his skin. The following morning, Gideon cleaned and loaded his revolver, though he hoped he wouldn't need to use it. Justice would be served through the law if possible. He dressed in his best shirt and vest, wanting to appear respectable when he confronted his wife's murderer. The ride to Sweetwater took just over an hour. The small town was bustling with its usual morning activity, wagons delivering goods, women shopping, men gathered outside the saloon discussing cattle prices and weather. Jenkins' boarding house stood at the end of the main street, a 2-story clapboard building with a small porch. Gideon tied his horse to the hitching post and straightened his hat before climbing the steps. Martha Jenkins looked surprised to see him when she answered his knock. "Gideon." "This is unexpected. Are you looking for a room?" "No, madam. I'm here to see one of your boarders, a Mr. Richard Hargrove." Her expression shifted subtly. "Mr. Hargrove, he's taken a room here for the past month or so, distinguished gentleman from back east. Said he's considering investments in the territory." "Which room is his?" Mrs. Jenkins frowned. "Is there some problem, Gideon? Mr. Hargrove is a paying guest, and I can't just please Mrs. Jenkins," Gideon interrupted, struggling to keep his voice level. "It's important." Something in his expression must have convinced her. "He's in the room at the top of the stairs, first door on the right, but he mentioned at breakfast that he'd be visiting the bank this morning." "Thank you." Gideon turned toward the stairs. "Gideon," Mrs. Jenkins called after him, "you seem different today. Are you well?" He paused without turning back. "Better than I've been in months, Mrs. Jenkins." "Clearer." Gideon climbed the stairs with measured steps, his hand never straying far from the revolver at his hip. The hallway was narrow and dim, with 4 doors leading off it. Following Mrs. Jenkins' directions, he approached the first door on the right and knocked firmly. No answer came from within. Gideon knocked again, louder this time, but the room remained silent. After checking that no one was watching from the hallway, he tested the doorknob. Locked. Frustration mounting, Gideon considered his options. He could wait for Hargrove to return, but that meant risking a public confrontation. He could try to break into the room, but that might alert others in the boarding house. As he stood deliberating, a new thought occurred to him. If Hargrove was at the bank, perhaps he was indeed preparing to leave the territory. Gideon needed to act quickly. Moving to the window at the end of the hallway, Gideon could see it overlooked a narrow alley beside the boarding house. A drain pipe ran near the window, and the drop wasn't severe. Making his decision, Gideon returned to Hargrove's door, drew his knife, and worked it between the door and frame until he felt the lock give way. The room beyond was neat and orderly, far more luxurious than Gideon's simple cabin. A leather trunk sat at the foot of a well-made bed. A writing desk beneath the window held paper, ink, and a half-written letter. And on a shelf near the washbasin sat several small tins, including a blue one. Gideon crossed the room and carefully took down the blue tin. Opening it released the faint smell of something medicinal. Inside were white crystals that could have been sugar to an unsuspecting eye. This, Gideon was certain, was what had killed Rebecca. He was about to pocket the tin when he heard footsteps on the stairs. Quickly, he moved behind the door, the tin in one hand, his other resting on his revolver. The door swung open, and a well-dressed man stepped into the room. He was perhaps 40, with dark hair going silver at the temples and the confident bearing of someone accustomed to wealth and privilege. Richard Hargrove didn't notice Gideon until the door closed behind him. "Who the devil?" Hargrove began, but fell silent when he saw the blue tin in Gideon's hand. His expression shifted from surprise to careful neutrality. "I don't believe we've been introduced, sir. You seem to be trespassing in my private quarters." "You know who I am," Gideon said, his voice deadly calm, "and I know what you did to my wife." A flicker of something fear perhaps crossed Hargrove's face before his composed mask returned. "Your wife, I'm afraid I don't." "Rebecca," Gideon cut him off. "Rebecca Whitman. You poisoned her with whatever's in this tin." Hargrove's eyes narrowed. "You're clearly distraught, Mr. Whitman. Grief can make a man imagine all sorts of—" "I read your letters," Gideon interrupted again. "I know you threatened her. I know you came to our home while I was working the fields. And I know you put this in her tea." For a long moment, the two men stared at each other. Then Hargrove sighed and moved to the desk chair, sitting down with the casual air of someone discussing business. "You cannot prove any of this, of course," he said smoothly. A grieving husband, known to be spending his nights talking to himself at his wife's grave, making wild accusations against a respected businessman. "Who do you think people will believe?" "The sheriff might be interested in this poison," Gideon countered, holding up the tin. "Medicinal compounds for a heart condition," Hargrove replied with a shrug. "My physician in Boston can attest to my need for them." Gideon felt his carefully controlled anger beginning to slip. Why kill her when she'd already refused you?" Something ugly flashed in Hargrove's eyes. "Rebecca was promised to me long before she met you. Our families had an arrangement. Then her father's banking scandal happened, and suddenly she was gone, fled west like a thief in the night." "She loved me," Gideon said simply. "She chose me." "She chose wrong," Hargrove snapped, his composure cracking. "I offered her everything, a return to society, wealth, position, and she chose to remain in this God-forsaken wilderness with a dirt-poor cowboy. So you decided if you couldn't have her, no one would." Hargrove stood abruptly. "I think this conversation has concluded, Mr. Whitman. I'll thank you to leave my rooms before I call for assistance." "We're going to the sheriff," Gideon said, drawing his revolver. "You're going to confess to poisoning my wife." A cruel smile spread across Hargrove's face. "And if I refuse?" "Will you shoot me, further proving your instability?" The moment stretched between them, taut with tension. Gideon knew Hargrove was right. He had no real proof beyond the poison, which Hargrove could explain away, and the word of a grieving widower wouldn't count for much against a wealthy businessman. Before Gideon could decide his next move, a knock came at the door. "Mr. Hargrove," called Mrs. Jenkins' voice, "Is everything all right? I thought I heard raised voices." Hargrove's smile widened as he called back, "Everything is fine, Mrs. Jenkins, just a small disagreement with a visitor." "It's Sheriff Miller, sir. Says he needs to speak with you urgently." The smile vanished from Hargrove's face. "Tell him I'll be down shortly." "He insists on coming up, sir. Something about a telegraph from Boston regarding allegations of fraud." Color drained from Hargrove's face. In that moment of shock, Gideon understood Hargrove wasn't just a spurned suitor. He was a man fleeing his own crimes back east. "I'll need just a moment to," Hargrove began, but the sound of heavy boots on the stairs interrupted him. Panic replaced Hargrove's composure. His eyes darted around the room, settling on the window. In a sudden movement, he lunged for it. Gideon moved to intercept him, but Hargrove was quicker than expected. The older man shoved Gideon aside with surprising strength and yanked the window open. As Hargrove swung one leg over the sill, Gideon recovered his balance and grabbed for him. Their struggle was brief but violent. Hargrove struck out with unexpected ferocity, catching Gideon across the jaw. As Gideon staggered back, Hargrove got both legs out the window, clearly intending to drop to the alley below. The door burst open, revealing Sheriff Miller, a barrel-chested man with a stern expression. "Hargrove, stop right there." Hargrove hesitated for just a second, half in and half out of the window. That moment of indecision proved fatal. As he shifted his weight to pull back into the room, his grip on the window frame slipped. A look of pure terror crossed his face as he fell backward. There was a sickening thud from below, followed by silence. Sheriff Miller rushed to the window and looked down, his expression grim. "Broke his neck in the fall," he reported flatly. "Guess that saves the Boston authorities the cost of a trial." Boston authorities. Gideon asked, still holding the blue tin. The sheriff turned from the window. "Richard Hargrove was wanted for embezzlement and fraud, ruined dozens of families back east before disappearing with their money." His eyes narrowed as he noticed Gideon's revolver and the tin. "Mind telling me what you're doing here, Whitman?" Over the next hour, Gideon explained everything: the letters, Rebecca's journal entries, his suspicion that Hargrove had poisoned her. The sheriff listened with increasing concern, occasionally asking clarifying questions. "We'll need to exhume your wife's body," Sheriff Miller said finally. "If there's poison to be found, Doc Wilson might be able to confirm it." "Do what you need to do," Gideon said. The thought of Rebecca's body being disturbed pained him, but if it proved Hargrove's guilt, he would endure it. The next few days passed in a blur of activity. Rebecca's body was carefully exhumed and examined by Dr. Wilson, who confirmed traces of arsenic poisoning matching the contents of the blue tin found in Hargrove's room. A search of Hargrove's belongings revealed a journal of his own, detailing his pursuit of Rebecca and, in cold, clinical language, his decision to eliminate her when she refused to leave with him. The evidence was damning and complete. Word spread quickly through Sweetwater. The townsfolk who had whispered about Gideon's mental state now regarded him with a mixture of sympathy and respect. The man hadn't been mad with grief. He'd somehow sensed the truth about his wife's unnatural death. Rebecca was reburied in a proper ceremony attended by nearly everyone in town. Reverend Thomas offered a moving eulogy, speaking of justice served and peace restored. Throughout the service, Gideon stood silent and stoic, his eyes never leaving her casket. That night, as was his custom, Gideon sat beside Rebecca's grave. The newly turned earth was covered with flowers brought by townsfolk wanting to pay their respects. The wooden cross had been replaced with a proper headstone, the words "beloved wife, justice found" added beneath her name and dates. "It's done, Becca," Gideon whispered. "Hargrove can't hurt anyone else now, and everyone knows the truth." For hours, Gideon sat in silence, wondering if Rebecca would appear to him now that justice had been served. As midnight approached, he began to fear she was truly gone, her spirit finally at rest. Then, as the moon reached its zenith, the air beside him stirred. Rebecca materialized, more solid and clear than she had ever appeared before. Her smile was radiant, her eyes free of the sadness that had haunted them. "You look peaceful," Gideon said softly. Her message came to him stronger than ever. "I can rest now. Justice is done." "Will I see you again?" he asked, his voice breaking. Rebecca's expression softened with love. "Not like this. My time here is ending." "I don't know how to say goodbye," Gideon admitted, tears finally breaking free. "Then don't," came her reply. "Say until we meet again." "How do I go on without you?" Rebecca seemed to consider this, her form glowing softly in the moonlight. "Live, Gideon, live fully. Love again if it finds you. That's how you honor what we had." "I don't know if I can. You can. You will." "Promise me?" Gideon swallowed hard. "I promise, but I'll never forget you, Becca, not ever." Her smile was like sunrise after the longest night. "I know, and I'll be waiting when your time comes, but not soon. You have much life ahead." As dawn approached, Rebecca's form began to fade, more gradually than usual. Before she disappeared completely, she leaned forward as if to kiss him. This time, Gideon felt the unmistakable warmth of lips against his, not a memory or imagination, but a true farewell. "Until we meet again," came her final message as she faded into the morning light. "Until we meet again," Gideon whispered to the empty air. Spring came to Montana territory in a riot of wildflowers and new growth. Gideon's fields were planted, his cattle growing fat on fresh grass. The cabin that had felt so empty after Rebecca's death slowly began to feel like home again. He added a room, repaired the roof, and planted the flower garden she had always wanted. The townsfolk no longer whispered about Gideon's mental state. Instead, they spoke of his resilience, his quiet strength. Several unmarried women still made excuses to visit his homestead, but Gideon remained politely distant. His heart wasn't ready, might never be ready for another love. One afternoon in late April, as Gideon returned from town with supplies, he spotted a wagon broken down on the road near his property. A young woman was attempting to change a wheel, struggling with tools too heavy for her slender frame. Gideon stopped his horse. "Need some help, madam." She straightened, pushing a strand of auburn hair from her face. "I'd be most grateful." This wheel picked the worst possible place to break. As Gideon dismounted, he noticed her eyes a warm brown that crinkled at the corners when she smiled. Her practical dress and sturdy boots spoke of a woman accustomed to frontier life. "I'm Rose Daniels," she said, offering her hand. "Just moved to the territory. My brother's homesteading about 10 miles north, and I'm joining him to teach at the new school." "Gideon Whitman," he replied, taking her hand briefly. "My place is just over that rise. Let me fix that wheel for you." As Gideon worked, Rose told him about herself, 24 years old, previously a teacher in Kansas, determined to make a new start after losing her fiancé to cholera the previous year. "Folks told me I was crazy to come out here alone," she said, watching him secure the wheel. "Said a woman needs a husband in these parts, but I figure life's too short to wait around for things to happen to you." Something about her forthright manner reminded Gideon of Rebecca, not in appearance, but in spirit. The thought brought a pang of grief, but also, surprisingly, a small measure of comfort. "I know something about loss," Gideon said quietly. "My wife passed last summer." Rose's expression softened. "I heard in town they say you brought her killer to justice. That took courage." Gideon shrugged uncomfortably. "Just did what needed doing." With the wheel repaired, Gideon helped Rose back onto her wagon. As she gathered the reins, she looked down at him thoughtfully. "Mr. Whitman, would it be forward of me to stop by someday? I'm collecting stories of the territory for my students. I'd like to hear yours properly." Gideon hesitated only briefly. "I'd be honored, Miss Daniels. Sunday afternoons I'm usually home." Her smile brightened her entire face. "Sunday it is then, and thank you for the help." As Rose's wagon continued down the road, Gideon felt something stir within him, not love, not yet, but perhaps the first tentative step toward healing. That night, Gideon visited Rebecca's grave as he still did several times each week. The visits had changed over time, less about grief now, more about quiet communion with his memories of her. "I met someone today," he said softly to the headstone. "Just briefly. She reminds me a little of you, has your spirit. Her name is Rose." The night breeze stirred the wildflowers on the grave, and Gideon could almost imagine Rebecca's approval in the gentle movement of the petals. "I'm not ready," he continued. "Might never be, but I remembered what you said about living fully. I think maybe I'm starting to understand what that means." A sense of peace settled over him as he sat in the quiet darkness. Rebecca hadn't appeared to him since the night after Hargrove's death, and Gideon knew in his heart she wouldn't again, not in this life. But he felt her presence in other ways, in the beauty of their land, in the memories they'd created, in the strength he'd found through losing her. Sunday arrived bright and clear. Gideon spent the morning tidying the cabin, feeling strangely nervous about Rose's visit. At midday, he heard the rumble of wagon wheels approaching. Rose arrived with a basket of fresh bread and preserves. "A thank you for fixing my wheel," she explained, "and something to sustain us while you tell me about Montana Territory." They sat on the porch, talking as the afternoon sun bathed the land in golden light. Gideon found himself speaking more than he had in months, telling Rose about his journey west, his dreams for the homestead, and eventually, carefully, about Rebecca. "She sounds remarkable," Rose said when he finished. "The kind of woman who leaves an impression on the world even after she's gone." "She was," Gideon agreed quietly. Rose's gaze drifted to the distant hillside where the small cemetery plot was visible. "Would it be improper to ask if I might pay my respects?" The request surprised Gideon, but he nodded. "I'd be honored to take you." They walked together to Rebecca's grave, now surrounded by a neat fence and blooming with the wildflowers Gideon had planted. Rose knelt beside the headstone, touching it gently. "Hello, Rebecca," she said softly. "I'm Rose. I want to thank you for the love you gave Gideon. It shaped him into the good man I'm getting to know." Gideon stood a few paces back, throat tight with emotion. There was something profoundly moving about Rose's simple acknowledgement of Rebecca's continuing importance. As they walked back to the cabin, Rose slipped her hand into the crook of Gideon's arm, not a romantic gesture, but one of companionship and understanding. "Thank you for sharing her with me," she said quietly. "Thank you for wanting to know her," Gideon replied. The weeks that followed brought regular visits from Rose. Sometimes she came with specific questions for her students. Other times, she brought a picnic basket and suggested they eat by the creek. They spoke of books, of teaching methods, of cattle and crops. They shared stories of their lives before Montana, carefully navigating around the tender wounds of their respective losses. By midsummer, Gideon realized that the anticipation he felt before Rose's visits had evolved into something deeper. He found himself thinking of her during quiet moments, wondering about her opinions on matters large and small. He noticed the way sunlight caught in her auburn hair, the thoughtful furrow of her brow when she considered a difficult question. One evening, after Rose had returned to her brother's homestead, Gideon made his way to Rebecca's grave, conflicted. "I think I'm falling in love again, Becca," he admitted to the night air. "It feels like betrayal somehow, but also like healing." The stars overhead seemed to brighten momentarily, as if in response. Gideon remembered Rebecca's parting words, "Love again if it finds you. That's how you honor what we had. You knew, didn't you?" he whispered. "You knew before I did that my heart wouldn't stay broken forever." The night remained silent, but Gideon felt a sense of blessing settle over him, a permission he hadn't realized he'd been seeking. The following Sunday, when Rose arrived, Gideon had prepared a special dinner: venison stew, fresh bread, and blackberry pie. They ate at the table he'd built with Rebecca, now covered with a new checkered cloth Rose had brought on a previous visit. After dinner, as twilight painted the sky in purples and pinks, they sat on the porch swing Gideon had recently added to the cabin. "Rose," he began, his voice uncertain. "I want to tell you something, but I'm not sure how." She turned toward him, her expression open and patient. "Just say what's in your heart, Gideon. That's always the best way. These past months, knowing you, it's awakened something in me I thought died with Rebecca." He took a deep breath. "I care for you, Rose, deeply, and it frightens me because I never expected to feel this way again." Rose's eyes softened. "Caring for me doesn't diminish what you felt for Rebecca." "I know that now," Gideon acknowledged. "But I need you to understand she'll always be part of me, part of this place. I would never ask you to forget her," Rose said, taking his hand. "Love isn't a finite resource, Gideon. It expands to encompass what it needs to." Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, Gideon leaned forward. Their first kiss was gentle, tentative, the kiss of two people who understood both the risk and value of opening their hearts again. When they separated, Rose smiled through tears that had gathered in her eyes. "I've been hoping you'd do that for weeks now." Gideon laughed softly, feeling lighter than he had in over a year. "I'm a slow learner, I guess." As summer turned to fall, Rose spent more time at Gideon's homestead. Her brother teased her about courting that widower, but approved of the match. The townsfolk of Sweetwater nodded knowingly when they saw the pair together, pleased to see Gideon finding happiness again. By Christmas, Rose had accepted Gideon's proposal of marriage. They planned a spring wedding when the wildflowers would be blooming again across the Montana landscape. The night before their wedding, Gideon made one final solo visit to Rebecca's grave. Snow had recently melted, revealing the first green shoots of the season around the headstone. "Tomorrow I marry Rose," he said quietly. "I wish you could have known her, Becca. I think you'd have been friends." He placed a bouquet of early spring flowers on the grave. "She understands about us. She doesn't try to replace what we had, just builds something new beside it." Gideon knelt, touching the headstone one last time. "I'll always love you, that hasn't changed. But I've kept my promise to live fully. I hope wherever you are, you're proud of me for that." As he stood to leave, a warm breeze swept across the hillside, unusual for early spring. It carried the faint scent of lavender, wrapping around Gideon like an embrace. "Thank you," he whispered, smiling through tears. "Until we meet again, my love." The wedding took place beneath the big oak tree near the creek, with wildflowers scattered across the ground and birdsong filling the air. Rose wore a simple white dress adorned with blue ribbons, carrying a bouquet of prairie flowers. Gideon, clean-shaven and nervous, waited for her with Reverend Thomas beside him. The entire town of Sweetwater turned out for the celebration, bringing food and good wishes. Even Rose's students came, presenting their teacher and her new husband with a quilt they had made together, each square representing something they'd learned about Montana territory. As Gideon and Rose spoke their vows, a shaft of sunlight broke through the oak's branches, illuminating them both. Several guests later remarked that they'd never seen a more perfect moment, as if nature itself was blessing the union. That evening, after the guests had departed, Gideon took Rose's hand and led her to a spot he'd prepared near the oak tree, a small table set with candles, 2 glasses, and Rebecca's favorite wildflowers in a vase. "What's this?" Rose asked softly. "I wanted to include her somehow," Gideon explained. "To acknowledge that she's part of our story too." Rose's eyes filled with tears. "It's perfect." They sat together as twilight deepened into night, sharing memories and hopes for the future. When the first stars appeared, Gideon felt a sense of completion, of circles closing and new ones beginning. "Look," Rose whispered, pointing to the east. A shooting star streaked across the darkening sky, brilliant and beautiful in its brief journey. Gideon smiled. Rebecca always loved shooting stars, said they reminded her that beauty doesn't have to last forever to matter. Rose leaned her head against his shoulder. She was right. Life on the homestead took on new rhythms with Rose's presence. The cabin expanded again to include a proper schoolroom where Rose could teach during winter months when travel to town was difficult. Fields that had lain fallow during Gideon's grief were replanted and flourished under their combined care. A year after their wedding, Rose gave birth to a daughter they named Rebecca Rose Whitman. Holding his newborn child, Gideon felt the circle of life continuing, the pain of his past transformed into the joy of his present. As the years passed, the homestead grew into a prosperous ranch. 2 more children joined their family, a son named James and another daughter, Elizabeth. Rose continued teaching, eventually establishing a proper school in Sweetwater that served children from throughout the region. Gideon still visited Rebecca's grave regularly, sometimes alone, sometimes with Rose and the children. He told his first wife about the milestones of their lives: Rebecca, Rose's first steps, James's talent with horses, Elizabeth's gift for storytelling. He shared the small daily triumphs and challenges that made up a life well lived. On the 10th anniversary of his marriage to Rose, Gideon sat with his family on the porch of their now substantial home, watching the sunset paint the Montana sky in spectacular colors. "Papa," 12-year-old Rebecca Rose asked, "will you tell us again about how you and Mama found each other?" Gideon smiled at his daughter, seeing echoes of both the women he had loved in her curious eyes and determined spirit. Well, it's really two stories woven together. It begins with another Rebecca, your namesake, and how her love shaped me, even after she was gone. As twilight deepened around them, Gideon told the story of loss and discovery, of a spectral presence beside a grave, and of the healing power of love that transcends even death. The children listened, wide-eyed, while Rose's hand found his, squeezing gently and understanding. When he finished, 9-year-old James looked thoughtful. So first Mama Rebecca helped you find Mama Rose, even after she went to heaven, in a way, Gideon replied. She taught me that love doesn't end, it just changes form. Later that night, after the children were asleep, Gideon and Rose stood together on the porch, looking out at the land they'd nurtured together. 10 years, Rose murmured, leaning against him. Sometimes it feels like yesterday we met on that dusty road. And sometimes it feels like you've always been here, Gideon replied, wrapping his arm around her shoulders. Like all of this, you, the children, our life together was waiting for me to find my way to it. Do you ever regret any of it? Rose asked softly. The pain you went through, Gideon considered the question carefully. No, he said finally. Without that journey, I wouldn't be who I am, we wouldn't have what we have. Rose nodded, understanding. Life writes stories we'd never imagine for ourselves. True enough, Gideon agreed, thinking of the young cowboy he'd once been, riding into Montana territory with nothing but dreams and determination. How could that young man have foreseen the path his life would take? The love he would find, lose, and find again in new form. As moonlight silvered the landscape before them, Gideon felt profound gratitude for all of it, the joy and the sorrow, the endings and beginnings that had shaped his existence. For Rebecca, whose love had given him roots in this wild land. For Rose, whose love had helped those roots flourish again after the harshest winter of his soul. For their children, who carried forward the best of both women, and for those silent nights beside a grave when a ghost had sat beside him and said nothing, yet somehow said everything that mattered. Come to bed, my love, Rose said, tugging gently at his hand. Tomorrow's another day of this beautiful life we're building. Gideon followed her inside, closing the door on the Montana night. Outside, stars wheeled overhead, timeless witnesses to human stories of love and loss, endings and new beginnings, all playing out beneath their ancient light. On the hillside, wildflowers nodded in the gentle breeze that swept across Rebecca's grave, carrying the mingled scents of sage, earth, and lavender into the endless prairie night.